In the year 1206, on the windswept plains of Mongolia, a moment unfolded that would alter the trajectory of world history. Long before
For decades,
global
the
trade
Mongol
routes
steppe
connected
had been
continents,
defined
and
by
centuries
betrayal,
before modern
shifting
superpowers
alliances,
emerged, the
blood
fate of Central
feuds.
Asia hinged on a brutal and decisive confrontation remembered as the Battle of Dalan Balzhut. This was not merely a clash of rival clans. It was the crucible in which Temujin became Genghis Khan and in which fractured tribes were forged into a single, disciplined nation. For decades, the Mongol steppe had been defined by betrayal, shifting alliances, blood feuds, and survival. Leadership was fragile. Loyalty was transactional. Power was temporary. Yet out of that chaos rose
For
a man
decades,
who
the Mongol
understood something
steppe
deeper
had been
than
defined
warfare.
by
He
betrayal,
understood
shifting
organization.
alliances,
He understood
blood
merit.
feuds.
And above all, he understood unity. The Battle of Dalan Balzhut marked the final consolidation of power that allowed Genghis Khan to unite the Mongol tribes under one command. It was the birth of a new political order and the foundation of what would become the largest contiguous land empire in history. To understand that transformation is to understand how unity, vision, and strategic ruthlessness can reshape the world. Long before the name Genghis Khan echoed across continents, the Mongolian steppe was a fractured world defined by wind, distance, and distrust. The land itself was immense, rolling grasslands stretching for thousands of miles, where winter temperatures could plunge far below zero and summer droughts could wipe out entire herds. Survival was never guaranteed. Wealth was counted in horses and livestock, not coins or land deeds. In this unforgiving environment, loyalty was fragile, and power shifted as quickly as the weather. The Mongol steppe was not a nation. It was a patchwork of tribes: Tatars, Nayman, Merkit, Karite, Tiikyid, each fiercely protective of its autonomy. Alliances were temporary, often sealed with marriage or oath, and just as often broken when opportunity arose. Blood feuds could last generations. Raids were common. Leaders rose and fell not through institutions or stable succession, but through force, persuasion, and the constant management of rival ambitions. This fragmentation created a cycle of instability. A tribe weakened by winter losses might raid a neighbor for livestock. That neighbor, seeking revenge, would form an alliance with a third group. The balance of power never settled. There was no central authority capable of imposing lasting order. To outside empires, particularly the powerful Jin dynasty to the south, the steppe tribes were divided and therefore manageable. Disunity was not just a social condition, it was a strategic vulnerability. Into this volatile world was born Temujin, around 1162. His early life would shape him in ways no formal education ever could. His father, Yasugei, was a minor tribal leader who understood the dangers of steppe politics. When Temujin was still a boy, Yasugei was poisoned by rivals. With his protector gone, the family's status collapsed almost overnight. Abandoned by their own clan, Temujin, his mother, and his siblings were left to fend for themselves on the open plains. For years, survival meant scraping by on wild roots, small game, and whatever fish they could catch from frozen rivers. Hunger was constant. Humiliation was familiar. At one point, Temujin was captured by a rival tribe and enslaved, forced to wear a wooden collar to prevent escape. He eventually broke free, but the lesson was permanent. Weakness invited domination. Those hardships did more than harden him physically. They reshaped his understanding of loyalty and power. Temujin experienced firsthand what it meant to be abandoned when political winds shifted. He saw how quickly alliances dissolved when they were based solely on convenience or bloodline. And he learned that survival required more than courage. It required dependable structure. Tribal politics on the steppe revolved around aristocratic lineage. Leadership typically belonged to noble families, and status was inherited rather than earned. Warriors fought for their immediate clan, not for any broader identity. This system preserved tradition, but it also entrenched division. Talented individuals born outside elite bloodlines had limited opportunity to rise. Resentment simmered beneath the surface. Temujin recognized that the old model perpetuated instability. If loyalty was tied only to kinship, then betrayal was inevitable whenever interests diverged. If leadership depended solely on birth, then competence became secondary. For a society constantly at war with itself, that was a fatal flaw. As Temujin began gathering followers, he made a radical choice. He promoted men based on merit, on loyalty, skill, and reliability, rather than ancestry. Former servants, blacksmiths, even men from defeated tribes found places in his inner circle if they proved themselves trustworthy. This approach was not idealistic, it was practical. On the steppe, a capable commander could mean the difference between survival and extinction. His message resonated with those who had little stake in the old hierarchy. Ordinary herdsmen and warriors saw in him an opportunity that had never existed before. Loyalty to Temujin meant protection, shared spoils, and a chance to advance. In return, he demanded discipline and unwavering commitment. At the same time, he understood the importance of personal bonds. He revived and redefined the ancient tradition of sworn brotherhood, forging alliances not just through bloodlines but through chosen loyalty. Yet even these bonds were tested. His former blood brother Jamuka would eventually become his fiercest rival, representing the traditional aristocratic order against Temujin's merit-based vision. Their conflict symbolized more than a personal feud, it embodied two competing models of leadership. While other tribal leaders relied on charisma and temporary coalitions, Temujin focused on building a durable network. He distributed rewards carefully, ensuring that followers felt invested in collective success. He integrated defeated enemies rather than simply eliminating them, expanding his base instead of shrinking the field through endless cycles of revenge. In modern terms, he was redesigning the operating system of steppe society. He shifted the foundation of power from lineage to performance, from fragmented clans to organized units. This transformation did not happen overnight, nor did it proceed without resistance. But with each small victory and each new alliance, the possibility of unity began to replace the inevitability of division. By the early 13th century, the Mongol steppe was still turbulent, but the balance was shifting. Temujin was no longer just another tribal contender. He had become a focal point for those exhausted by chaos. His rise signaled that a different kind of leader was emerging, one who saw beyond immediate raids and seasonal rivalries toward something larger and more enduring. Before the Battle of Dalan Balzhut, there was no Mongol nation, only competing tribes locked in perpetual struggle. But in the mind of Temujin, a new vision was taking shape. He understood that unity was not merely desirable, it was necessary for survival in a world where stronger empires watched from beyond the horizon. The fragmented steppe had produced countless warriors, but it had never produced lasting cohesion. That would change. And when it did, the transformation would not just alter the fate of the Mongol tribes. It would reshape the balance of power across continents. The road to Dalan Balzhut was not paved in a single campaign or defined by one dramatic showdown. It was shaped over decades of calculated alliances, painful betrayals, and relentless conflict. By the time 1206 arrived, Temujin had already survived more reversals and political shocks than most leaders of his era. What distinguished him was not simply his endurance, but his ability to learn from every fracture in trust and every battlefield reversal. One of the earliest turning points in his ascent came through his alliance with Togrul, the powerful leader of the Karaite tribe. Togrul had once been a sworn ally of Temujin's father, and when Temujin sought support in reclaiming his abducted wife from the Merkit tribe, it was Togrul who answered the call. Their joint campaign was successful, and for a time, the partnership elevated Temujin's status across the steppe. Backed by Karaite strength, he was no longer an isolated upstart but a rising force. Yet on the Mongolian steppe, alliances rarely survived ambition. As Temujin's influence expanded, suspicion followed. Togrul began to see not a protege, but a rival. Political maneuvering intensified. Accusations circulated. Eventually, the alliance collapsed into open conflict. The war that followed was decisive. Temujin's forces defeated the Karaite, and Togrul fled, only to be killed shortly thereafter. The lesson was clear. In a system built on temporary loyalty, yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's threat. Temujin emerged stronger, But he also understood that personal relationships alone could not sustain a durable coalition. If Togrul represented political pragmatism, Jimukha represented ideological opposition. Once bound to Temujin as an Anda, sworn blood brother, Jimukha embodied the traditional aristocratic order of the steppe. Where Temujin elevated men of humble origin, Jimukha championed noble lineage. Their rivalry was not merely personal, it reflected two competing visions for Mongol society. Jimukha's supporters believed leadership belonged to those born into it. They viewed Temujin's promotion of commoners as disruptive, even dangerous. For them, hierarchy preserved stability. But for many ordinary warriors, that same hierarchy meant permanent limitation. Temujin's willingness to reward loyalty and competence over ancestry created a powerful contrast. He was not dismantling tradition for its own sake, he was replacing a rigid structure with a more functional one. The conflict between the two men unfolded in a series of brutal encounters. At times, Jimukha gained the upper hand, rallying aristocratic clans to his banner. But over time, Temujin's model proved more resilient. Warriors fought harder for a leader who recognized their contributions. Commanders chosen for ability rather than pedigree performed better in battle. Slowly, momentum shifted. Jimukha's coalition fragmented under pressure, and many of his followers defected. When Jimukha was eventually captured, he reportedly refused to submit and asked for an honorable death. Temujin granted it, closing a chapter that had defined much of his early career. While personal rivalries dominated headlines of the steppe, larger tribal confederations posed structural threats. The Tatars, longtime enemies of Temujin's family, were among the first major groups he moved to eliminate. Their defeat was swift and severe, sending a signal that old blood feuds would no longer dictate the balance of power. The Merkits, who had once kidnapped his wife, were pursued relentlessly and crushed. Each victory reduced the number of independent actors capable of destabilizing the region. Perhaps most significant was the confrontation with the Nayman, one of the most powerful Western tribes. The Nayman commanded substantial manpower and strategic territory. Their defeat required coordinated planning and disciplined execution. By this stage, Temujin's forces were no longer a loose coalition. They were evolving into a structured army, organized in units that cut across tribal lines. This integration diluted traditional loyalties and strengthened centralized command. What made these victories transformative was not simply the battlefield outcome, but what followed. Temujin did not allow conquered tribes to remain intact as potential centers of rebellion. He redistributed families into mixed units, blending former enemies with loyal followers. Leadership positions were reassigned based on merit and proven commitment. In effect, he was dismantling the old tribal framework and replacing it with a new national structure. Still, resistance did not disappear overnight. Pockets of opposition lingered. Some leaders refused to accept the erosion of aristocratic privilege. Others feared the implications of centralized authority. For centuries, the steppe had functioned without a singular sovereign. The idea of one man holding ultimate command challenged deeply rooted norms. The final resistance before 1206 was less about a single decisive clash and more about the gradual suffocation of dissent. Smaller uprisings were confronted swiftly. Potential rivals were either absorbed into the new system or removed. By this stage, Temujin's military reforms were fully operational. His forces moved with coordination that traditional tribal armies could not match. Communication improved. Discipline tightened. The cost of rebellion became unmistakably high. By the time the dust settled, the political landscape of the steppe had fundamentally changed. The old order, defined by fragmented clans and hereditary privilege, had been weakened beyond recovery. What stood in its place was a centralized authority built on loyalty, structure, and shared ambition. For a modern American audience, especially those who have built companies or navigated decades of organizational change, the pattern is recognizable. Consolidation is rarely clean. It involves difficult decisions, broken partnerships, and resistance from entrenched interests. But without consolidation, scale is impossible. Temujin understood that unity required not only defeating rivals, but redesigning the framework that produced rivalry in the first place. By 1206, the road to consolidation had narrowed to a single path. Opposition had been subdued. The major tribal confederations had fallen. What remained was the formal acknowledgement of a reality already forged in conflict. The gathering that would soon take place, where Temujin would be proclaimed Genghis Khan, was not the beginning of his power. It was the recognition of it. The steppe, once divided by suspicion and blood feud, was on the verge of something unprecedented. The campaigns, betrayals, and hard-fought victories leading to Dalan Balzhut had cleared the field. What emerged next would not be another tribal alliance. It would be a unified force poised to move beyond the horizon. But of institutional reinvention. What emerged was not merely a dominant warlord, but the architect of a new political and military order. At the heart of that transformation was military organization. Unlike traditional tribal forces that gathered temporarily under charismatic leaders, Temujin built a standing structure based on a precise decimal system. Units were organized into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Each level had designated officers responsible for discipline, logistics, and combat readiness. This was not accidental. It created accountability. Every soldier knew his place. Every commander understood his chain of command. For a modern audience accustomed to corporate org charts and clearly defined reporting structures, the innovation is striking. On a steppe where alliances had once depended on personal loyalty alone, this system institutionalized authority. It reduced ambiguity. It allowed large numbers of mounted warriors to maneuver with coordination across vast distances, sometimes hundreds of miles in a matter of days. What had once been a loose tribal coalition became an integrated military machine. Yet structure alone does not secure power. Temujin also mastered psychological warfare and strategic control. He understood that reputation could travel faster than cavalry. When tribes resisted, he responded decisively and often brutally, ensuring that news of resistance and its consequences spread widely. At the same time, those who submitted were frequently spared and incorporated into the expanding order. This dual approach created a powerful incentive structure. Loyalty brought protection and opportunity, defiance invited annihilation. Strategic control extended beyond the battlefield. Intelligence networks gathered information on rival movements and terrain conditions. Scouts reported enemy weaknesses. Communication systems allowed messages to move quickly across the steppe. These mechanisms turned unpredictability into calculated advantage. By 1206, opposition forces were not just outmatched in numbers, they were outmatched in coordination and foresight. All of this momentum culminated in the Great Assembly of 1206, known as the Kurultai. Leaders and representatives from across the subdued tribes gathered on the steppe in what was both a political ceremony and a public declaration of a new order. This was not a mere celebration of conquest. It was the formal acknowledgement that the era of fragmented tribal rule had ended. At the Kurultai, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, commonly rendered in English as Genghis Khan. The title is often translated as universal ruler or oceanic ruler, suggesting authority as vast and boundless as the horizon itself. The symbolism mattered. For generations, power had been localized and temporary. Now it was centralized and institutional. The birth of the title, Genghis Khan, marked a psychological shift as much as a political one. It redefined identity. Allegiance was no longer primarily to clan elders or aristocratic bloodlines. It was to a singular sovereign and to the collective entity forming under his command. The Mongols were no longer just tribes, they were becoming a unified people. Central to this consolidation was a new legal framework often referred to as the Yasa. Though not preserved in a single written document, the Yasa represented a body of decrees and principles governing conduct. Theft, adultery, desertion, and insubordination were punished severely. At the same time, religious tolerance was encouraged. Artisans, envoys, and administrators were granted protection. In a society long defined by personal vengeance and shifting custom, codified rules introduced predictability. For viewers who have spent decades navigating legal systems, contracts, and regulatory frameworks, the significance is clear. Stability depends on rules that apply broadly and consistently. The Yasa was not merely about punishment, it was about creating trust in a shared system. When people believe that standards are enforced fairly, cooperation becomes rational rather than risky. Perhaps one of the most transformative reforms was the deliberate reorganization of tribal identity. Rather than allowing conquered tribes to remain intact, where they might plot rebellion, Genghis Khan redistributed families and warriors into mixed units. Former enemies found themselves serving alongside loyal supporters. Bloodlines were diluted within military formations. This was a calculated move to prevent the re-emergence of factionalism. It also fostered a broader sense of collective identity. When survival and advancement depended on cooperation within mixed units, old grudges gradually lost their power. Shared campaigns, shared spoils, and shared hardship created new bonds. Over time, loyalty to the Mongol state began to outweigh loyalty to individual clans. What took shape after Dalan Balzhut was not simply a dominant tribe ruling others. It was a unified military state built on structure, discipline, and centralized command. Logistics improved. Supply lines were organized. Standards for training and readiness were enforced. The decimal system allowed for rapid mobilization, while legal reforms provided internal cohesion. For an American audience of seasoned professionals and entrepreneurs, the parallels are unmistakable. Scaling an enterprise requires more than ambition. It demands systems, accountability, and the willingness to dismantle outdated structures that no longer serve growth. Genghis Khan did not inherit a unified nation, he engineered one. He recognized that consolidation without institutional reform would collapse under its own weight. The climax at Dalan Balzhut was therefore not simply the suppression of final resistance. It was the moment when power transitioned from personal dominance to systemic authority. The steppe, once a landscape of fractured loyalties, now operated under a centralized framework capable of projecting force far beyond its borders. In the years that followed, this unified military state would move outward, into northern China, across Central Asia, and eventually toward Eastern Europe. But those campaigns were made possible only because of what happened in 1206. The battle and the reforms that followed transformed a divided region into a cohesive force. On the windswept plains of Mongolia, victory was not defined solely by who stood last on the battlefield. It was defined by who could turn conquest into order. In that sense, the true triumph of Dalan Balzhut was not destruction, it was construction. Out of chaos emerged structure. Out of rivalry emerged unity. And from that unity rose a power that would reshape the map of the world. The Battle of Dalan Balzhut in 1206 was not simply the final skirmish of tribal rivalries. It was the decisive moment that transformed Temujin into Genghis Khan and scattered clans into a unified nation. On those vast grasslands, unity replaced fragmentation, merit replaced aristocracy, and strategy replaced impulse. From that consolidation came an empire that would stretch across continents and redefine global exchange. But at its core, the transformation began with one principle: unity under disciplined leadership. For those of us reflecting on decades of leadership, enterprise, and change, the lesson is timeless. Sustainable power is not built on temporary alliances. It is built on structure, shared purpose, and decisive action when the moment demands it. In 1206, on the Mongolian steppe, the moment arrived, and Genghis Khan seized it.